Hey guys, and welcome. This is John Adamson, the Rehab and Documentation Guru. So I want to do a video. I've done a religious perspective on vaccine mandates and whether one who, especially has a Judeo-Christian ethic, could argue for an exemption from the vaccine and by default also argue against vaccine mandates. But I wanted to let you know that I reached out to a man who's recognized as one of the foremost humanists in the United States, a man who I was introduced to about 6 years ago when he was interviewed by my former seminary professor, Dr. Albert Mohler, and his name is Dr. Phil Zuckerman. Dr. Zuckerman started the first humanist school of thought in the United States, and I reached out to him with the question whether a humanist perspective could be utilized in arguing, one, against an individual taking a vaccine, or two, against an individual being mandated to take the vaccine. And he helped clarify those questions for me, and I was thankful that he took his, this guy's a busy guy. He heads a department of a major university. But he responded very quickly, and appreciate his response. But his response was what I suspected. So he said, as a humanist. Now, a humanist is somebody that a priori rejects God and ultimately will find common human wisdom to be the defining basis for developing a worldview. And there's some basic tenets in humanism, which he did elaborate, and I appreciated what he did. But one tenet of humanism is what's known as altruism. So altruism is generally a disregard for self-preservation for the sake of others. It's putting others before you. This is actually not inconsistent with a Christian worldview, based upon what Jesus did for Christians, that he put the needs that we have, which is we can't earn our way to God, therefore we need somebody to pay for our sins. And so he debased himself and put his needs behind, or he put our needs before his needs inherent in his position as being God and man. This is a little theological, I apologize, but altruism has its basis in multiple religions, and so the needs of others ahead of self. And so what he was saying is it would be hard he doesn't know of any humanists who hold the perspective that one can put their self needs ahead of the others. So what is an a priori assumption of that? It is this: by taking the vaccine, you are putting others' needs ahead of you. That would be a separate discussion, and maybe I'll touch on that in a little bit. The other argument he would use as a humanist, which really boils down to a materialistic worldview where there is no God, and we can derive ethics and morality from the human experience and what we have available to us through what's called empiricism, meaning what we can sense, what we can glean from our senses. So he would say that empiricism, and this is the argument he uses, that empirical data more generally supports the use of vaccines being a positive societally than a negative. And he used the polio vaccine as evidence of that. So based on those two principles, altruism and empiricism, what he's saying is he doesn't see a support from a humanist perspective to not take the vaccine. In other words, he's saying that both altruism and empiricism support taking the vaccine or having vaccine mandates, is what he shared. So anyway, I appreciated his feedback, and if you want to follow him, I mean, he is a deep thinker, and even though I would disagree with his worldview, I appreciate the fact that he reached out to me, or I should say, got back to me, because all he knows is I'm some peon just reaching out to him. But we're all human beings, right? Of equal value. At least that's what the Bible tells me. So anyway, but he got back to me. Phil Zuckerman. I would suggest you check him out. Humanist. His background is sociology, and he's done a lot of studies of worldviews and their impact in different parts. I know he did one big study on Scandinavian countries. Spent some time over there collecting data. So he's not some insignificant dude. I mean, he's written some books. So check him out if you have an interest in humanism. But let me point out some problems with both his perspectives on the humanist side. Another point he brought up was one humanistic principle is autonomy. So autonomy would say it's my choice, my body, my choice. Therefore, if the virus was only impacting me, I would have a right to refuse on humanist principles taking the vaccine. So that's what he shared with me. But then he gets into altruism, saying that there's a greater good concern here because it's not just a virus that only comes to us. We have the potential to spread it and impact more people. So anyway, those are his perspectives. So let's look at all of those factors. First of all, let's look at autonomy. Is it right for an individual to say it is my body, my choice? This is the argument that the pro-choice, or I should say pro-abortion lobby has been making for many years. My body, my choice. So what are they saying? Basically, if a woman is pregnant with a baby inside her, then she has the right to autonomy of her body, choosing whether she remains pregnant or not. In other words, whether she keeps the baby or has an abortion. But based on the altruism principle, wouldn't it be correct to say that it's not just your body, you're influencing other people, therefore it would be altruistic to allow the baby in you to live and come to full term? And in fact, some studies have shown that women, even in cases of rape and incest, who give birth to their rapist's baby, and I'm not even going into how evil rape is or forced incest. Those are evils, obviously. We're not talking about that. But what studies have shown is that women that carry those babies to term generally experience positive benefits, whereas the negatives of the guilt associated with the murder of the baby do carry over long into the woman's life, even if she was raped or had incest done to her. So there are studies supporting that. Empiricism, going back to the empirical point of view. So anyway, my concern with the my body, my choice argument on the pro-abortion side is that should be equally applied to the anti-vaccine side if you're humanist. Now, what about altruism? Is it true that a greater good is being done by getting the vaccine? Well, it's still too early to tell. And in fact, some significant scientists, including the guy who developed the mRNA technology used in Pfizer and Moderna's vaccines, and a Nobel laureate Peace Prize winner for his work in virology back in 2008 or 2009, has come out against mass vaccination against COVID-type diseases. He has big concerns about mass vaccination. They have more concerns about what are the long-term effects, and they could be more deleterious than the short-term, including the creation of strains that are much more virulent because of mass vaccination efforts. So the question of altruism is, there's an a priori assumption that it is better for society in the long run to have vaccines when the studies aren't there yet, which goes to empiricism. We just don't have the data for long-term effects on the human race. So we can't say for certain that long-term effects. Now, we do have initial data that seems to support that short-term, people have the disease less frequently, less virulently, and less duration, which means the less potential for spread if they have the vaccine versus not. But we have seen that people still get the disease with the vaccine, and some have gotten it pretty seriously and some have died. The other thing is VAERS. going back to the vaccine reporting, VAERS has clearly demonstrated over the years that underreporting occurs related to vaccine injuries. However, I would say that that's probably going to improve because now more people are aware of VAERS, and so they're going to be more likely to report vaccine injuries. And so that might change over time, but studies have shown that anywhere, it's something like from 1 to 13% of vaccine injuries are actually reported. So the vaccine injury rate from the COVID vaccine is likely much higher than reported. Because sometimes, frankly, doctors misdiagnose too. So they see a patient come into them with a certain set of symptoms, like let's say cardiac, and they don't do a thorough enough history and they don't find out, oh, the patient got the vaccine a couple weeks ago. But they give them diagnoses without the relating it to the cause and effect relationship with the COVID vaccine. So the data, the empirical data is skewed. Here's another thing. A lot of people will use this study, and I've seen people use it on Facebook. 95%, and some studies suggest 96% of doctors have gotten the vaccine. So where does that study come from? Well, it comes from data that's collected by the American Medical Association. The American Medical Association has posited through their study that about 95% of physicians have gotten the vaccine. And this is what's called argumentum ad populum, or basically argument related to how popular something is, how many people, I forget what the technical or the way to translate that to English is, but the more people that believe something, the more likely it is to be true. Well, that's not necessarily the case. You could have a majority of people believing something, it doesn't necessarily make it true. And I will tell you what happens with most professions. Most professions do this. They'll look at what the research is from their journals that they get. So the AMA, the APTA, AOTA, ASHA, they'll get that evidence from those articles and they'll go, okay, it must be true. AMA supports it. However, you got to remember, when studies are done, the sample size is relatively small. Now, they'll say, okay, we sampled amongst all specialty groups. But here's the problem. The AMA, their total membership represents only 15%. 15% roughly of the total population of the United States physicians. And that's been in decline for many years. Less physicians join the AMA, even though their dues is relatively low. So part of the problem is sample size. They've got a decent sample size within their membership, but when you look at overall, a lot of physicians don't belong to the AMA. And some of those may very well not belong because they're concerned about the political agenda of the American Medical Association. And every organization has a political agenda. So their sample may be skewed. That's part of the problem. This goes back to argumentum ad populum. The majority of physicians, say they got the vaccine. A lot of physicians have, I shouldn't say a lot. There have been instances where some physicians have come forward and have said, keeping confidential, keeping their identity confidential, that they told their supervisor, their hospital, that they got the vaccine because they were afraid of the consequences if their peers found out they did it. So there may be some skewing in data related to that. It's like on polls. If a pollster calls you, believe it or not, more Republicans are likely to lie that they're Democrats than vice versa, because they're afraid of repercussions. So there is this bias that occurs based on the group that you find yourself in and how unpopular you view your view to be, that you might be more likely to skew data by giving a false answer. So going back to empiricism, we don't know, one, the long-term effects of the vaccine, and two, we really can't trust entirely the data that's coming from the AMA. I'm sorry. And three, we cannot trust entirely the data that's coming from VAERS. And we're certainly not going to trust the data that's coming from the pharmaceuticals, because they have a huge financial interest in this. And who is the number one funder of AMA periodicals? Pharmaceutical companies. If you look at any AMA publication, if you can get a hard copy, look at the ads. Where do the ads come from? All pharmaceuticals, pretty much. Occasionally you'll find non-pharmaceuticals, but not likely. So anyway, we go back to altruism. Is it a greater good to get the vaccine? I would say we don't know yet. And if we are creating super strains by mass vaccinations for what is a derivative of the common cold, which technically should not have mass vaccination efforts, and as you get used to that cold, the population gets used to the cold, their responses diminish to runny noses and a little bit of fever and aches, and that's about it. So we may be creating more and more virulent strains through mass vaccination. So altruism may not be a proof for taking the vaccine or mandating the vaccine. And then empiricism, we don't have the empirical data yet for long term. And doesn't matter what, if the Pfizer vaccine got accepted, it does not matter. They've got accepted purely on short-term basis. Do you know how long before this whole pandemic it took for a medicine to go through? The average was something like 12 to 14 years. 12 to 14 years. You want to know why medicines that come out first as name brand and before they get generic, why they're so expensive? Because these companies have been sitting on this technology and developing it for so long. In part, yes, they're greedy, but in part, they're recouping some of the losses they've experienced for years, waiting for the final approval of the FDA. And how fast did the FDA approve the vaccines this time around? Less than a year. And we have no long-term data to support the use on people that says that long-term we're not going to see problems. None. So the humanist perspective of first of all, autonomy. The argument, my body, my choice, falls flat on its face when you consider it next to altruism. When altruism supposedly is the guiding factor over autonomy in humanist thought, then you look at the pro-abortion side argument, my body, my choice. Altruism should trump that. But it doesn't in a humanist perspective. And that's a problem. And then the empiricism side falls apart too, as I've shared. So it may be long-term, like 20 years from now, or 15 years from now, or whatever, 10 years from now. We do find that you can make a better altruistic and empiricist argument from the humanist perspective about taking the vaccine or forcing people to take the vaccine. But right now, that's really up in the air. And so from a humanist perspective, what I would tell you is this. If you don't have a theistic religious undergirding to your anti-vaccine statement or belief or whatever, then from a humanistic perspective, you've got to harp on the fact that we can't prove altruism and we cannot prove empiricism. I would focus on those terms in your argument that you should not be able to, not have to take the vaccine. And then go back to it's my body, it's my choice. Anyway, hope that was helpful. Again, check out Phil Zuckerman. I appreciate him getting back to me. I believe that his worldview is deficient, but he seems like a nice guy, and he's not here to defend himself. All I'm going on is what he shared with me via email, and he was nice enough to do that. So shout out to Dr. Phil Zuckerman. Check out his work. He's a very accomplished man. And anyway, hope that helped. John Adamson, the Rehab and Documentation Guru. Take care. God bless.